Spain, what a beautiful country. Whether you live there now, you've lived there before, or you're thinking of living there, I think you might be really interested in staying with us and listening to our chat today.
Yeah, Spain. So we'll be discussing our shared memories and experiences of the earlier period from Spain's transition from dictatorship through to democracy, your experiences in the early 80s, my experiences in the early 80s up to the present day. So yeah, hope you'll stay with us and have a listen. So how are you doing, Roseanne? Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, Zoe. I'm fine. I'm talking to you today from just outside Glastonbury in the UK. We have just had a heat wave, and just this morning the temperatures have dropped, which actually I'm quite pleased about because I can sit here with something on and not feel too
Yeah.
hot. Where are you, Zoe? Where are you this morning?
So I'm in our chill out area on our mountainside, just outside of Javia, which, for those who don't know, is on Spain's Costa Blanca, just between Alicante and Valencia. And it's also very hot, hence I'm in a shady area that I thought I could find to be outside today.
What sort of temperatures have you got?
Well, yesterday it went up to about 32. I think
Yes.
today it's meant to get up to about 35. And
Whoa.
all
Yeah.
the humidity that hits me.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm at that. Most women would understand beyond 40s that it's so well.
Yes, yes. And I remember the humidity. I'm really
Yeah.
excited about our part one of our chat today, Zoe. Where shall we begin? How shall we start off?
Would you like to share how you first came to Spain? What brought you here and when?
Okay, all right. Well, that takes us back to 1978, a long time ago. I came to Javier on holiday with a boyfriend, fell in love with Javier, enjoyed a couple of weeks there, and I can remember as I left thinking, oh gosh, I'd love to be staying here longer. I'd love to come back. Then I went back to my real life in England. A couple of years later, I was offered a job in Spain or in England, and the place in Spain was Javier, so I couldn't believe it. It brought me back to Spain, and that was lovely. So that I then had about 6 months living there, which gave me a bit of a taste for how things were. It was beautiful. A taste for actually spending some time living there, learning a bit of the language. And then after that job finished, back to the UK, back to work, and but with the idea that I would love to get back, travel a bit, and get back to Spain. And
Mm.
then in 1980, a girlfriend of mine said, I'm going down to Malaga. I'm going to be, staying there for 6 months or so or whatever. Let's see what happens. Do you want to come too? I was busy in London with a job, a house share, all the things that we're doing. And I stayed put and worked through the autumn and winter. But one cold, wet, grey, dismal day in London, I was sitting in my office, looking out of the window thinking, what am I doing? I could be down in Malaga, with my friend, enjoying the winter in Malaga. So I got up from my desk in London. I was working in the West End, and I walked down to a travel agent in Regent Street and I booked a one-way ticket to Malaga. So I booked it for the 24th of February, 1981. It gave me a month to give my notice at work, to get things settled, and I was very excited about it. And then on the
Mm.
23rd of February, I had a call, or I don't know how things worked in those days. I don't ever know what we did without mobile phones and messages coming through just like that. But anyway, somehow I was
Yeah.
told that there was a problem in Spain. I didn't know what it was. There was a problem in Spain, and my flight might be cancelled or delayed. So I was a bit, oh, well, that's a nuisance. Um, there I was all ready to go. And then on the 24th, I got a message to say, no, it's fine, you can travel.
Hmm.
Later, I mean, I was just a girl sitting in West Sussex wanting to travel down to Spain. I had no idea of what was going on and what was causing that problem.
Yeah.
Later, I found out that on that evening of the 23rd of February, 1981,
Mm.
Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero
Yeah.
made an attempted coup on the Spanish Parliament in Madrid He
mm,
arrived there, guns blazing, ordered all the politicians to the floor, and he held them
mm,
hostage overnight um,
mm,
because he wasn't happy. He wasn't happy with what was going on. But in the early hours of the morning, King Juan Carlos, in military uniform, and actually, I'll see if I can get it very quickly on my phone. In military uniform, there he is.
oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Came onto the Spanish radio and television, spoke to the Spanish people, and that is recorded as a very defining moment in the history of Spain for
Mm,
the continuance of democracy, which he'd introduced.
yeah, yeah.
So there I was just thinking, oh, great, I can fly down to Spain. This is lovely. What had actually happened was a huge moment in the history of Spain.
Yeah.
Um, so, the hostages were released, everything went back to normal, and
Mm,
on went Spain in the form of democracy. And one
mm,
other little snippet of information, Zoe, which I think is very interesting historically, which I sort of knew in the back of my mind, but this has led me to look it up and find out a little bit more.
mm,
Juan Carlos, King Juan Carlos, he became king in 1975 on the death of Franco. For those who are a little bit patchy on the history of Spain, the civil war in Spain was from 1936 to 39. Franco won the war, and Spain then went into the many years between 39 and his death in 75 under his
mhm,
dictatorship.
yeah.
So if you were happy to go along with everything he was doing, you were in a safe space. But if you had anything to say about anything, you were not. Um,
Absolutely. Mm,
anyway, so when the royal family went into exile in 1939, Juan Carlos as a young boy, that was it. They were out of the country. But Franco brought Juan Carlos, the young Juan Carlos, back to Spain in 1948
yeah.
to give him an education. So basically, he was sort of grooming him to be the next leader and
Mm,
to continue the authoritarian method for Spain. So
yeah.
his education, Juan Carlos's education, was under Franco. And in 1969, I read last week, Franco declared to Spain that Juan Carlos would be his successor. So when he
Mm,
died in 75, Juan Carlos was his successor. The monarchy then came in. There was the new King of Spain. But he decided to do things differently and he went the democracy route. And I think that is absolutely fascinating.
it is. It's fascinating. And I think we've discussed this before. A lot of people that came to live here back in the day or here now really know very little about that period. And it's incredibly important to understand because even though it seems, in the distant past, it's not at all.
No.
And to this day, it's still very present.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those that lived through it, the division, politics. And for those that don't know, Juan Carlos is still alive and kicking somewhere around Abu Dhabi because of the corruption charges. So, yeah.
Yes. Yes. And it's his son, Felipe, who is
Mm,
in charge. Yeah. So anyway, I hope I didn't ramble on too much there, but I got quite carried away looking into that. I thought it was absolutely fascinating how that transition happened,
mhm.
and that I actually flew to Spain on that very significant historical day of the 24th of February 1981. So that was the beginning of my story.
Yeah.
Shall I go on to how things were when I arrived in Spain? Um,
I arrived in Malaga in 1982 and discovered a very different world to what you'd come from in Sussex.
yeah, a very,
Quite an
very different world. Yeah. Um,
transition.
it was very different, very eye-opening. I absolutely loved it. The people I met in and around that area were all absolutely delightful. So I spent a few months there. During those months, I met a young Spanish man who was to become my husband. And I just completely fell in love with Spain. So I saw some interesting things during the time that we were sort of socializing and out and about in Malaga. I can remember I can remember being in a nightclub on more than one occasion and seeing, the guy dancing in a partner neck with a partner next to me with a gun sticking out of his jean pocket or in his jacket or whatever. So yeah, it was quite an eye opener. And when I went back and forth from England to Spain, but when Antonio and I decided to start our life together, I did say to him, I know a very lovely place where I feel very comfortable. It's a place called Javier, which is further north. Would you be prepared to at least look at it and see if we might start our life there and bring our children up there rather than in this, what I considered then slightly cowboy land, to be honest, with no disrespect to Spain or the Spanish. But, there was so much going on in Malaga at that time. It was fairly crazy. So we set off for Javier and we made our life in Javier from then on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, to explain to those that wouldn't know what we're referring to there were no extradition laws back there. So this whole costa, Spanish Costa Mediterranean, the Mediterranean, became known as the Costa del Crimen.
Yes.
So there was quite a lot of import export going on, specifically North
Yes.
Africa in the beginning, but then things went a little bit sideways when I think South America, Colombia became involved. You're talking about the guns and everything, but for those that like Guy Ritchie movies, Spain was one long, this area of Spain was one long continuous Guy Ritchie movie. I mean, obviously not everywhere, but yeah, I experienced it around here as well, and there were some very well-known British criminals around. So
Yes.
it wasn't that
Yes.
unusual to find people, like you say, with guns very openly. And yeah, that one film I'd recommend, well, there's two actually. Sexy Beast is a good one, and The Business, which is based down that way, the early 80s of Spain, and it's a real eye opener. But yeah, even when we came here in sort of mid 80s, that was still very apparent, and I had
Yes.
a few of my experiences. So
Yeah.
when someone would go, yeah, I'm into a bit of import, export, a bit of this, a bit of that.
I mean, at the end of the day, that there was all of that going on, but people were trying to find their way, weren't they? In the early 80s, we're only talking between 5 and 10 years from 1980 to 85, for example. We're only
Yeah,
talking within 10 years of the end of a dictatorship which had governed them for so long. So everybody
yeah,
was finding their new way. And
yeah.
we didn't
Origin.
know it then, but it was an extraordinary time to be in Spain.
It was, yeah, it was a real cultural explosion, cultural transition. And I think in many ways it became like their equivalent as well of like the swinging 60s because of all the repression.
Yes.
People would have to smuggle in music, vinyls. And so, yeah, once Franco passed, that's when the La Movida, we talked about La Movida Madrilena began, which was about 1978 to 1988, I believe, something like that. So that was a huge explosion of like film, fashion, music, nightlife. That's when people like, Pedro Almodovar, the Spanish film director, became famous. There was lots of bands that I remember from back then, Alaska, Radio Futura, Mecano.
Hmm.
Yeah, so
Hmm.
yeah, for them it was an amazing period. So again, if you didn't know anything about what had come before, you might have been a bit flummoxed back then of this sudden like, and of
Yeah.
course, from one extreme to another. I remember I mentioned to you my father was, well, I'll explain afterwards how we came to Spain, but my father was on the airport bus going to Alicante, and back then they'd put, films on for the passengers.
Yes.
And I'll never forget, he said to me, they just put this hardcore porn film on the bus. You've got families, there are kids, and it was this nobody almost seemed to bat an eyelid, or if they did, they certainly didn't say anything. And even kind of later on, I remember going to the airport and the hardcore porn was literally everywhere. There's no top shelf. It was I put my money down on the counter to pay for something. I was like, oh, this looks like a gyno manual. Like, but yeah,
Mm.
so there was. everything and anything you wanted. It was that kind of
Yes.
yeah, literally an explosion.
Yeah.
It's calmed down a bit in the last 25 years or so, but
Yeah, it was. It's hard to imagine. But yeah, I think they were just trying to, they were just exploding with, as you say, anything goes. And actually, anything really
exactly.
didn't go. So then it had to all pull back a little
Yeah,
bit.
safe a little bit.
So Zoe, that was me arriving in Spain in 1978, and then my very first few years during the early 80s. When did you first arrive in Spain?
So we first came here in 1985 on holiday, specifically to a beautiful town called Altea, which is just like 30 minutes south of here. We had some friends that had moved over. And so, through a contact of my father's, we found an old village house in Altea to rent for a month. We came over in our VW camper van, myself, my 2 year old, no, my year old, was she a year at the time? Anyway, yeah, my sister and my parents. And I think yeah, they instantly fell in love with the place. And Altea was also very bohemian, full of musicians. As you know, my father used to work in the music business, so he had contacts through that, artists, and yeah, just an amazing time, amazing place. And we had been looking around. My father, as you know, is from India and had always been searching to move back to the sun somewhere else and couldn't find his place. We were going to go to Australia, that fell through. Never considered Spain. And then within that month of being here, both my parents, yeah, they totally fell in love with the place. And 6 months later, we moved here very impulsively. So I was 13 when we moved here from Surrey, which is a suburb of London. And initially, of course, it was a great adventure. My father had flown out during those 6 months to find an apartment, and that was on the main road, which back then was called the Generalissimo, named after
Yes.
Franco. Now it's the N332, and very
Yeah.
old apartment, very low ceilings. I said my mum used to have to stoop to do the washing up. The beds were quite short back then because the Northern Europeans were quite a bit taller than the Spanish back then. And yeah, it was quite a shock coming from Surrey. And even though we didn't really live a very I don't know, not I wouldn't say normal life, but my parents were always very open-minded. We travelled, but still being on holiday somewhere and then going to live somewhere. And even though it didn't seem that far away culturally and being so soon after the transition, it was very, very different.
Yes.
So I remember our neighbours downstairs. I think they were a bit shocked. Suddenly, these foreigners appear, and my dad looked quite flamboyant with his long hair and beard and jewelry and earring and tattoos. And
Oh,
they,
wonderful.
I was learning. I'd had a tutor back in the UK, but I certainly was nowhere close to fluent. So my parents were sort of relying on me to an extent. I remember going downstairs and we were having a bit of a tiff because we had this terrace, this beautiful terrace that my dad had thought came with the apartment, but it was a communal terrace. It had the washrooms. So, the old stone sink. And so suddenly they would appear on the terrace and my dad like, what are you doing up here? And nobody spoke, they couldn't speak each other's language. I remember going into their apartment to try and talk to them and they had still had the picture of Franco on the wall next to the Virgin Mary. It looked very austere. So, this was where my parents were obviously very young back then. They were still in like early 40s, 30s, and didn't know about this history, you see. So there wasn't that understanding again of this big cultural transition. And also in those days, there were very few families that moved to Spain. They were mainly, retired, especially to the
Yes.
Javier area.
Yes.
And those families that did move over, they were usually working, sort of for some kind of corporation, and the kids would be in the private school. But I actually ended up in the local Spanish school. So we were only a handful back then that were sort of going fully immersed into Spanish life. So it was a little bit shocking in the beginning when the rose tinted glasses kind of fell off, and it's like, oh God, we've given up everything.
Yeah.
We have to make a life here. And I suddenly realized I didn't really speak the language. I was a young teen, became very introvert, trying to adjust, and it took I think over 6 months or something to get me into Spanish school because they said no, you need to speak the language. And we were like, well, it's not enough just learning with a teacher. You need to be fully immersed. I need to be around the others. So there was a bit of a battle to get me in. So yeah, they weren't always easy. That first
Yeah.
year, especially.
No,
Yeah.
it's a lot to settle into, yeah. And a lot of
Yeah.
what you say, a lot of what you say triggers memories for me as well. You know, the language, all the different things. Obviously, our experiences were very different because you were 12 when you came, and I was, I suppose, about 24, 25, something like that. So it's very, very different. I didn't speak the language when I arrived in Malaga, but of course it was a lovely way to learn because my boyfriend then was Spanish, and so I was learning as I went. He spoke quite good English, and everything I learned I could practice immediately. And I can remember in those early days constantly playing cassettes. That shows how old I am. Constantly playing cassettes just of Spanish people talking. I didn't understand it, but I just got that sound constantly going, and that really helped, and I enjoyed that. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's fascinating. Um,
Yeah.
and talking about, you know, the differences you were mentioning there, the local Spanish people, seeing the really, I suppose, the first foreigners really coming and settling at that time.
Yeah.
Mostly retired people and then occasional families. And I came
Mm.
across that in the work that I set up actually. We started our own little company in Javier, of property sales and rentals and things. And all the rental clients I dealt with, all of them were English retired people. They had
Yeah.
all invested in a property in Javier where they could spend the 6 months of the winter, and then
Yeah.
they rented it out in the summer, and from their income in the summer, that paid for the house for the whole year. And in those days, property was very affordable. It was very affordable. These days, I mean,
Very.
it's changed so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that I think that could be another topic we can look
Abs-
at in more
Yeah.
detail, Zoe, in another chat. The property,
Yeah.
the
We both have
money.
in that. Yeah, I've worked as an estate agent a few times over the years, and nearly 23 years ago as well, and in the present day a bit. And yeah, there's quite a lot to talk about there because also that period was the boom period. Like Spain literally exploded on every, like I said again, on every level. So the construction boom was going on, and so a lot of people of my age actually left school, the guys at 16, and went straight into work. There was no point for them going into what they saw any further education or training and anything else because the big money was in construction. So they were getting great wages.
Mm.
Um, everyone had their brand new cars on HP, so I came from back in the UK, everyone would have like a second-hand car when you started driving, some old Mini. So if you always get a few bangs on the way, suddenly you've got these young kids, 17, in these high-powered, expensive cars, like everything. What my parents had kind of escaped from, like the whole credit thing and the extreme materialism, suddenly, unfortunately, began here too. It was quite extraordinary, but sadly, what came with that as well over that sort of a decade was a huge amount. It was like a massacre on the roads because you've got these 17, 18-year-olds driving these extremely fast cars just past their tests. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
everything that goes with that. Yeah, absolutely. And there was something that came into my head there. What was it? The that whole transition
Mm.
of those youngsters driving those cars on HP and one thing another, all the things that they could do going into construction, earning that sort of money. This was completely differently from how their parents had lived and from their grandparents, a
Yeah.
complete different world because the area we're talking about in Spain, which I'm sure reflects over many, many areas of Spain, it was coastal, so it was a fishing village,
Mm.
farming, agriculture, the people lived on the land. I
Mm.
knew a family where the grandfather, the one who didn't have the opportunity of the HP and the fast cars and all of that, their grandfather would walk over the mountain from Javier. For those that don't know the area, we have a very, excuse me, beautiful, beautiful mountain, Mongo, um, which divides Javier from Denia, a very busy, bigger working town on the other side, isn't it?
Yeah.
But in those days, coming back to the grandfather, who was, in Franco times when it was just fishing and agriculture, some of them would walk to work over the mountain because there was an opportunity in the next village town that they couldn't get in Javier. It was so, so different. And that explosion that happened in the 60s, which brought the construction work and all of that. It was the construction on the roads, the constructions of property. And I think it was, I mean, we're still in Franco times. It was under his direction to
Mm.
modernize Spain because package holidays started. In the
Yeah.
60s, package holidays started, and to begin with, there were just a few. But
Mm.
I think I'm right in saying, Zoe, and correct us if we're wrong, if I'm wrong here, folks. I think I'm right in saying by the mid 60s, package holidays to Spain had become a huge, huge popular place to be. It was fantastic financially and for all the different reasons. So the work that was generated for that young generation in Spain was just extraordinary. And of course, they all ended up with their luxury villas, with their fast cars, with everything. And the
It was all
turnaround really was so quick.
for a lot of people, and because of the construct, so you would have, I said, simple folk, agricultural folk who suddenly would sold their land and became, in some cases, without exaggerating, millionaires
Oh, yes,
overnight,
yes,
particularly
yes.
owned the literally by the beach. I mean, we saw it firsthand, new people. And you're talking about walking, which is actually quite funny. Some of them, or many people, couldn't afford vehicles way back. They obviously had donkeys,
Yeah,
literally,
yeah.
and went from donkey again to fast car with no driving license. So we did experience that as well. But yeah, it's a fascinating time. I was going to say something else about along those lines, but I can't remember what it was referring to. Oh, you said about the tourism. Also the Scandinavian boom down in like Torremolinos, and I think that came a little bit earlier than the kind of British boom. So the Scandinavians came over, and then there's a fascinating story about the mayor of Benidorm back in the day getting on his moped. And I don't know how long it took him to get to Madrid to plead with Franco to allow the tourists, like the women, to wear bikinis and be allowed to be in the beach area in bikinis because back then that was prohibited. So
Which
yeah,
reminds me of sorry, Zoe, did you want to say something else? It
no, you carry
reminds
on.
me of a story of a very dear girlfriend I had back in the day, and she was 15 years older than me, and she'd come to Javier, to Spain, in the 60s.
Hmm.
And she was known locally as La Chica de los Pantalones because she wore trousers.
Yeah,
So the day she actually went onto the beach with a very, very substantial bikini. I'm not talking about anything we see these days, a very substantial bikini. I think she was asked to leave the beach. I'm pretty sure in my memory that the she was reported to the police for wearing a bikini. So absolutely, people can't imagine, and we're only talking about the 60s. It's not so
no,
far away. Um, and at that time, they created a series on Spanish television, which I ended up absolutely loving. I became completely obsessed with it. I loved it so much. And it was called Cuéntame cómo pasó, which means, tell me how it was, which I thought was beautiful anyway. And it was a Spanish family, it was set in Madrid, and they were a very, normal, average, lovely family, mum, dad, abuela, the grandmother, three children, different ages. Um, talking about the 60s, still in Franco time, the eldest son had become quite political. So the mother was always absolutely terrified that he wouldn't get home that night or he'd say the wrong thing, all of that going on. Then the younger children. But the thing that struck me, probably the episode that struck me so much, was the episode where they'd saved and saved and saved to get a train to Benidorm. And this was like an amazing thing for them to do. They were going to Benidorm. The grandmother, Abuela, she packed food for that could have fed an army for 2 weeks before they got on the train. And the
yeah,
family. Fast forward to their arrival in Benidorm. to see their faces when they first went onto the beach, the children's faces of delight.
Mm.
The mother was called Mercedes. Mercedes' expression when she saw all the American, probably American, but English and all the foreign women walking
Yeah,
along the street in their bikinis. And of course,
yeah.
his face also when he saw all these gorgeous women walking around in bikinis. It was fabulous. And that
Yeah.
series really put into perspective, it really showed the story through the 60s and 70s of life in Madrid. And yeah, it was wonderful. So yeah,
Perhaps if you maybe find it, maybe it's still around somewhere, like on YouTube. We could put a link in. That would be interesting. I'd quite like to watch that. I
I
don't
will
know if I watch.
search for that. I will search for that episode because I can see their faces now,
There was
coinciding.
only there were only two TV channels. I think it was RTV one and two, and then I think we also had the Catalan channel because I never forget seeing that the British series EastEnders. So yeah, in 1986 in Catalan, and that was absolutely hilarious. Anyone who
Hilarious.
understands, like, based on the East End of London with the Cockney, but instead they were speaking Catalan dialect. Well, no, sorry, Latin.
Oh, how
Yeah,
wonderful, how wonderful. Yes,
back
you forget those things, the things that we experienced and lived through back in the 80s. I can remember waiting for over a year for a telephone line to be connected because every house didn't have a telephone. That
yeah,
was fact. And there weren't
yeah,
telephone lines everywhere. And I can
yeah.
remember, yeah, waiting. And I can put a year to it because my first son was born. So it was 83, 84. So I think in
Mm.
84 we finally got our phone connected. And that was like this huge celebration. But there
Yeah,
was
I remember.
there was a loveliness about it. There was a
Yeah,
charm about it.
yeah, because you could still go down to the local office and speak to someone face to face if you had any problems. I remember the Telefonica offices very well.
Yeah.
It was the same for us. We had to wait such a long time, so you just had to use the phone boxes also
Yes.
to call back to the UK to family
Yes. Yes.
and they're all, but you. So of course, like I said, everything has its pros and cons, but there was, I wouldn't say innocence is the wrong word to describe it, but there was a kind of lightness. I guess it was again that atmosphere because it was post, I say it again, post dictatorship. Don't get me wrong, everyone's going to have their own political idea on that era and their own experiences. And of course, like we've talked about for foreigners that lived or came back in the 70s, I've heard them say, oh, back then we could just leave our door open, there was no crime. And I'm not saying that wasn't true. And everything was easier. But as we also know, everything's easier as long as you don't open your mouth. As long as
Absolutely.
you're in agreement with the
Yeah.
regime,
Yeah.
everything's brilliant.
Yeah.
If you're not, and
Absolutely.
we can talk about that in part two. Both of us have first-hand experience of, well, some of your Spanish husband's family members, what happened, and
Yes.
I have friends and also yeah, their family members, and a friend of mine that had to flee the country in the early 70s. And even a boyfriend that I had, his father was petrified because he had long hair. And they, back in those days, long hair generally meant you were a communist. And that usually didn't end well for a lot of the males, the ones that would just disappear. So that's a whole different story that we can talk about. And
Yeah.
again, in a balanced way. I mean, I studied a lot about the Spanish Civil War, and I've spoken to many, many people about their own family experiences and interviewed people over the years. I did some things for a local paper, and it's a subject that fascinates me. But yeah, we
Yeah.
can talk about that another time.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many other things that we can talk about. But one thing, because we're probably going to finish our part one quite soon, but one thing I would like to end on, if you like, is the charm. And you mentioned the word innocence, and I think that the Spanish people always have that lovely, beautiful side to them, which is a little bit childish, a little bit frivolous. They love their fiestas, the sunshine, the paellas, the joy of life. I can remember them saying, "You English live to work." And we
Mm.
work to live. That's right. That was the way around it was. And it's so, so, so true. I think in, certainly many that I met, they had their priorities in the right place, family, all the things that were important to them, spending time together, the big family paella reunions every Sunday, um, just that whole connection. So I think it would be a lovely thing to leave on the charm and the beauty of Spain. Yes, of course, there's all of that going on in the background, but the reason that many of us fell in love with Spain and still fall in love with Spain, you're saying your parents, you went there for a short period of time, they just fell in love with it, as I did. And and we've seen that happening over the years. So many, and in more recent times, so many families and people coming out to Spain because of the wonderful holiday they've had. It's not hard to fall in love with Spain. There's so many beautiful, beautiful things, and the people, for me, essentially, have always been, full of heart and yeah, lovely. I've had wonderful experiences. We can chat
Yeah,
more
no,
about
talk
memories.
about every part of Spain is completely different, and the people, from
Yes,
north to south,
yes,
uh, and the coast isn't always an accurate representation of the
yeah,
country itself.
yeah.
Spanish people, that's me, over the years as well. Like they think this is Spain, well, this isn't the real Spain, and I have traveled quite a lot around Spain, and it's very true. Every area is very, very different, and Galicia, the Basque country, their own history, again, their own language. So these are
Yes,
other things that we can touch on.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. And yeah, I look forward to that. I look forward to that very much.
Okay. Well, we'll continue in part two then.
We'll continue. So, for those of you who've been with us today, I hope you've really enjoyed it. Zoe and I will be sharing more experiences and nostalgia, but also, the fascinating transition and history of Spain. So, do stick with us. Zoe, it's been lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. Until next time. Bye.
Bye. Bye.